Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some work that I'm pretty excited about and to get some feedback on. Again, just reiterating, I'm more than happy to take clarification questions throughout the presentation, but kind of substantive questions, I might ask you to hold them for a couple slides or until the end of the talk. So what I hope to show today is that federal housing policy that was designed to segregate people was actually quite effective in doing so. Specifically, cities that were appraised by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, that I'll describe in a couple slides, in the 1930s became far more segregated than cities that were ignored by HOLC. And for decades, scholars such as Massey and Denton, more recently Richard Rothstein, but Ken Jackson, and others were pointing to these massive federal interventions in the housing market as kind of foundational in shaping America's racial geography, blaming them for the segregation that we see today. But interestingly, there's still no empirical evidence to date of the magnitude or extent of this intervention. And I want to start where Maria Chryson and Kyle Crowder start their really great 2017 book, Cycles of Segregation. This is an excerpt from the first page of their book, and it's a quote from then Massachusetts Senator Edward Brooke, who was arguing in favor of fair housing legislation. He said, we proponents of this policy made two general assertions. One, that American cities are suffering, and suburbs are suffering from galloping segregation, a malady so widespread and so deeply embedded in our national psyche that many Americans, Negroes as well as whites, have come to regard it as a natural condition. And two, that the prime carrier of galloping segregation has been the federal government. So he's using this perhaps outdated metaphor of galloping segregation, but I use this excerpt because both of these points are really interesting and powerful and true, but also contrasting. One, he's saying that segregation is so ingrained in America that it seemed to be natural, but at the same time, despite this common understanding about segregation, the federal government is deeply implicated. And today's policy is going to focus on one federal policy, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and ask, did cities appraised by HOLC become more segregated than those it ignored? As we look at an HOLC appraisal map, which I'll describe in more detail in a few slides for Chicago. I'll describe what the HOLC program was, and then get into the details of the current study, in which I merge some archival data with contemporary data sets, and then I'll describe my analytical strategy results and some conclusions we can draw from this work before getting into those hard-hitting questions that you're hopefully all kind of saving up and then forgetting by the time it gets to the Q&A. So HOLC, or HOLC, was passed in 1933 and it was intended to be short-term relief for a housing market that was in dire straits. We typically consider the Great Depression to be an employment crisis, and it certainly was, but it was also a housing crisis. About half of mortgage debt in America was in foreclosure at this time period. And so HOLC offered individuals grants to either refinance loans that were at risk of foreclosure or buy back homes that had already been foreclosed upon. And they granted $3 billion these are 1933 dollars, $3 billion, in the first 2 years of this program. And the scale is pretty big here. HOLC touched about 1 in 10 residential properties in America. So even though HOLC was intended to be a short-term policy, it had two long-term implications or consequences. The first was that through a system of housing finance insurance, HOLC created the American Homeownership Society through the financial instrument of the long-term standard payment mortgage. And it's worth pausing to emphasize how important this change was, because prior to HOLC, there was no standardized mortgage credit available in America. If you were wealthy, you bought homes with cash, or you were kind of required to put these huge down payments on homes, or you were kind of at the mercy of what Robert Fishman referred to as a kind of patchwork of mortgage policies around cities and countries. So not only did HOLC kind of save this industry that was in distress, but it established the primary tool for wealth generation and accumulation for most Americans. Wealth that can appreciate over time, be tapped when income is inconsistent, and create opportunities for inter- and intra-generational mobility, such as through investments in education and subsequent home ownership. And this is in large part why the racist design and implementation and inheritance of HOLC is so important to study. And so that's where our focus is today, is HOLC's impact on segregation through redlining practices that Ken Jackson wrote about in the mid-1980s. So redlining refers to the denial of mortgage credit to people in communities of color. And so here is another one of these. They were called residential security maps. So HOLC hired appraisers to make hundreds of these maps for cities across the country. And in these maps, appraisers would rate the mortgage riskiness, the lending riskiness of every residential neighborhood, from A being the best grade, and those were green, and D being the worst grade, and those were red. And this is where the term redlining came from. This map of Atlanta really typifies the urban-suburban distribution of grades, where kind of central downtown areas tended to have the lowest grades, where kind of far-flung, wealthier, and whiter, more suburban areas were where almost all A and B grades were. And so housing finance over the next several decades became much harder to acquire in C and D neighborhoods. Appraisers not only gave grades to each of these neighborhoods, grades that were based on things like housing conditions, economic activity, and perhaps most importantly, race, but they filled out and wrote rich narratives of every single neighborhood in each of these cities. And so I'm going to dive into two excerpts of narratives from this red line downtown neighborhood and this green neighborhood here in a kind of suburban area. So here is only a fraction. This is, and I apologize for the small amount of font. This is only about a third or a quarter of the neighborhood description that the appraiser provided for this individual neighborhood. And each appraisal started with the favorable and detrimental influences of the neighborhood. And under detrimental influences was listed instability of income, mixture of racial groups, juvenile delinquency, infant mortality, vandalism, crime, etc. And then second was a description of the inhabitants of the neighborhood. So there were 10% foreign-born families, Syrians, Greeks, Italians, and Jews. So in the late 1930s, the wrong kind of foreign-born. And there were 40% Negro families. And it's important to note, of course, that Negro is the only racial category included here. Nathan Conley and Ken Jackson and others who have conducted deeper analyses of these appraisal narratives have documented the preoccupation, if not obsession, of appraisers with the presence of black households. That if a single black person lived in your neighborhood, you're all but guaranteed a D grade. Here is an appraisal or an excerpt of the appraisal of that green neighborhood here. The only mention of people of color was one of the detrimental influences is the difficulty of transporting Negro slaves, or servants, excuse me, to this far-flung neighborhood. No foreign-born families, no Negroes, and no risk of infiltration. So this was the term of the era to refer to racial turnover, and specifically increasing African American populations. And no relief families, so this was kind of welfare recipients. One famous kind of micro-level example of HOLC's consequences is Detroit's 8-mile wall. So this wall was created by a white neighborhood that was too close to a black neighborhood and therefore was at risk of infiltration. So they built this wall ostensibly to block African Americans from infiltrating their neighborhood, and were therefore able to acquire this mortgage assistance, while the black neighborhood, of course, was not. And this is not the only place where this happened. There are other examples in cities and other cities across the country, such as Atlanta and Miami. And parts of that wall still exist today in what has become perhaps the most segregated metropolitan area or city in the entire country. So this map shows, and again I apologize, the contrast is a little bit difficult here, but this is where 8 Mile Road is, and again there are parts of this wall that still exist today, some of which have murals on them, but you can see, I kind of challenge you to find a starker racial line here in another part of America, where you have blue dots just north of the wall indicating white individuals and green dots just south of the wall indicating African Americans. And so the purpose of this study is to connect the geographic patterns of this historic process to contemporary patterns of racial segregation. And this is work that's building on work by Dan Aronson and Dan Hartley and Bash Mazumdar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, showing that there are long-term implications of HOLC grades for kind of neighborhood level racial and housing characteristics, as well as some of my own work showing that there is a lingering mortgage lending inequality across these neighborhood grades. So many of you might be thinking, of course, HOLC was a very long time ago, and so it's worth thinking about the historical processes and place HOLC within them, the historical processes that have occurred since then, without, of course, this turning into a lecture on the history of American housing policy. So the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill inherited HOLC's redlining practices and also expanded the use of racial covenants, funneling billions of dollars away from urban communities of color and towards white suburban neighborhoods. And these programs were much larger than HOLC. By 1972, FHA, for example, had helped 11 million households buy homes. And home ownership increased over these 4 decades, from 44% to 63%. Fewer than 1% of these loans went to African Americans during this time period. So as home ownership opportunities were opening up for white households in exclusively white neighborhoods, we were building segregated public housing, using highways to segregate neighborhoods and connect white bedroom communities to job centers, displacing hundreds of thousands of individuals, primarily people of color, through urban renewal, leading James Baldwin to rename urban renewal as Negro removal. This conflation of race and lending risk on the neighborhood level constrained housing options for African Americans, creating opportunities for exploitation through practices such as block busting. Private lenders also adopted these practices of redlining that were initiated by these federal policies, and many scholars position this as an extension of Jim Crow as well as more contemporary lending inequality. And of course, HOLC did not invent racism in real estate, but it institutionalized it and gave it the backing, both federal and state and local, of government. And in doing so, it set these other processes in motion. Recently investigated, of course, famous by Richard Rothstein, but there's a long research record describing the segregationist nature of these policies. So my analytical strategy is designed in pursuit of a rather simple task, or straightforward task, exploring differences in the change over time of segregation between cities and towns, i.e. census places, that were appraised by HOLC and those that were ignored. My primary concern is black-white segregation for a number of reasons. We know again from the historical record from these appraisal documents that appraisers were quite sensitive to the presence of African Americans. We know that throughout history and even today, the black-white color line is stronger than other racial boundaries, especially when it comes to residential segregation. And data consistency is also a concern. So our definitions of Latino Americans and Asian Americans changed far more over the past century than our census's definitions of white and black. And one consequence of this is that neighborhood level data on Latinos doesn't exist for 1950 and 1960. So my ideal data set would have longitudinal measures of race, socioeconomic, and housing characteristics for geographically stable neighborhoods and places before HOLC and in every decade since. But, of course, unfortunately, those data don't exist. So I rely on kind of imperfect measures of changing geography, racial geography gathered from multiple data sources that I'll discuss in just a few slides. So my primary data for redlining's extent come from this amazing public resource, the Mapping Inequality Group. They went into the archives and digitized every redlining map, every HOLC map that they were able to find there. And you can see here the kind of geographic scope of HOLC's appraisal policies. And it really reached a lot of the country disproportionately, not surprising given the distribution of population sizes at the time. Fairly good coverage in the Northeast and the Midwest, in the Mid-Atlantic, but not so great kind of in the middle of the country. For each city, you can download 3 layers of data. So you can download the actual maps themselves as images. You can pull out the parts of those images that were just graded areas, or you can download polygons of the graded areas. So I take this mapping inequality data and I supplement it with a list of appraised cities from an Amy Hillier paper from 2005. The lists almost completely overlap. But you can see that there are some that are identified just by mapping inequality and some that are just identified by Hillier. The ones that are identified by mapping inequality are largely due to spillover from county-wide or metropolitan-wide appraisals that I'll describe in a few slides. It's a bit ambiguous why there are some cities on the Hillier list and not in the mapping inequality list. I did unfortunately find a few typos in her list. And it's possible that some of the cities that were on her list were not census places before 1930, so that's why they're kind of missing from the data set. Importantly, my results are completely indifferent to whether or not you use the Hillier measure or the mapping inequality measure. So I use the term appraised or graded or surveyed to define any 2012 census place that at least partially overlaps with the mapping inequality boundaries or is on the Hillier list. These are compared to ungraded places, ignored or unappraised or non-appraised places. So this is a technique that prioritizes parsimony, but may come at the expense of a more nuanced understanding of HOLC's appraisal practices. For example, again, I'm treating cities that only partially overlapped with or only partially appraised with cities that were completely appraised. I looked into alternative measures to operationalize HOLC, such as the percent of a city's geography that was appraised. And these were poor, surprisingly poor predictors of subsequent segregation trends. And perhaps I found this initially kind of surprising, but it's suggestive that this kind of institutional process of just being appraised is all that matters, that this is a city-level effect. So again, as I mentioned before, I combine multiple census data sources to track segregation over time. I have full count data from for 1920 and 1940. I unfortunately only have the 5% sample from 1930 because, for a reason that IPUMS has not told me, the full sample or the full count sample does not include neighborhood information. And I've had correspondence with them, and they've told me that they don't have any plans to add it. So I don't know if those files are just corrupt. So for these data sets, city and town is included in the records. And of course, full count census data are not available for later years, so I rely on the National Historic GIS system for tract level data for 1950 and 1960, and then neighborhood change database tract level data from 1970 forward. City and town are not included in these data sets, so again, I use a spatial join to identify census tracts that are within these 2012 census place boundaries. I use the three of the most commonly used measures of segregation: the isolation index, which measures the kind of typical tract of a black resident within a city; the dissimilarity index, which measures the percent of blacks that would need to change tracts within the city for there to be equal distribution; and then the information theory index, which is a measure of unevenness. Tracts didn't exist for many cities before 1950, so I have to use wards for neighborhood definitions for prior years, and then tracts afterwards. Importantly, again, the results are insensitive to whether I use wards or enumeration districts as neighborhoods, which are kind of even smaller geographic units that were available in these earlier censuses. And when I use data from this Cutler et al. Rise and Fall of the American Ghetto paper from 1999, when I use their data, the findings are again exactly the same. So some models include measures of segregation's covariates, and there's another challenge here regarding changing census data over time, because I need variables that are reliably collected over a century's worth of censuses. And the only ones that are reliably collected over all these censuses are population, percent black, percent foreign born, unemployment rate, and then this ratio of black to white home ownership, which is kind of a proxy for wealth inequality. And even there, I'm kind of limited in the 1950 and 1960 data only have non-white home ownership. They don't specify African American home ownership there. Cities and towns are included in the analytical sample if they meet several criteria. So there has to be a black population in the observed year of at least 100. There has to be at least 2 census tracts, so there can be segregation within a place. The place year must have full covariate information, and the place must be observed at least once before pre-treatment, so in 1920 or 1930, and then at least once after treatment, so 1940 and later. So my analytical sample is an unbalanced panel of 4,360 place years. I should note that the results are much stronger within a larger sample that are unrestricted by these criteria, and they also hold largely within a much smaller, fully balanced sample as well. So my estimation strategy is a simple difference in differences, the most basic version of which measures segregation as a function of an indicator for whether or not the city was graded by HOLC, an indicator for the post-treatment period, so this is 1940 and later, and then an interaction between the two. And the intuition here is that this tau allows me to estimate differences in the before to after change in segregation between graded and ungraded areas. There are 4 primary specifications. The first adds pre-HOLC controls, so 1930s city level characteristics. I then add time-varying sociodemographic characteristics on the city level. And I add city fixed effects without those time-varying covariates. And then I add everything, city fixed effects and time-varying covariates. Obviously, the pre-HOLC controls drop out with city fixed effects. All models include census division by time, census division time trend, specific time trends, and standard errors are clustered at the place level. And I think now is an important time, or maybe a slide or two late, to flag a really important endogeneity concern that many of you may be thinking about, which is that HOLC appraisal was not randomly assigned. So the guidelines from the policy requested appraisals of cities, of all cities in America, with a population of at least 40,000 people. So here we have a pretty big identification issue. However, as I kind of mentioned this very briefly earlier, there were several residential security maps that extended well beyond municipal borders. So the mapping inequality group, the data set includes many appraisals that were ostensibly just of one city, but included nearby suburbs, including 7 county-wide appraisals. So here we have Essex County in New Jersey, which is immediately west of Manhattan, and Lower Westchester County, which is immediately north of the Bronx. And both of these counties include dozens of municipalities. So because of this, there are a lot of cities that are below this 40,000 cutoff specified by the policy that ended up being appraised. In total, there were 118 appraised cities that had populations in 1930 below 40,000. There were also 31 unappraised cities above this 40,000 cutoff. And it's a little bit unclear why there are these larger cities, like Washington, D.C., for example, is not appraised. Amy Hillier suggests that it's possible that these archives were just lost to history, that these are false negatives. So we have the kind of smallest graded city was quite small, LaGrange, Illinois, with only around 10,000 people, and the largest ungraded city was Elizabeth, New Jersey, with over 114,000 people. So I take advantage of this imperfect implementation to hopefully address this endogeneity concern through 2 strategies that I call kind of inside-out strategy and an outside-in strategy. So the inside-out strategy involves taking progressively larger samples of cities around the 40,000 population cutoff. So I start with cities that are within a tenth of a standard deviation of the 1930s population distribution around plus or minus the 40,000 cutoff, then 2/10, 3/10, et cetera, up to 1 standard deviation around that cutoff. And then the outside-in approach starts by taking or takes progressively smaller samples from the nth smallest graded city to the nth largest ungraded city, and then comes in from those. And I'll show, I'll talk a little bit more about them when I show those results. So on to some results. So what I'm going to show you here are kind of average levels of black isolation index for each decade for cities that were appraised by HOLC in red and ignored in blue. And you can see in the 2 decades prior to HOLC, there was basically no difference, that these cities had relatively similar levels of segregation. If anything, the cities that were to be appraised are kind of less segregated, though of course the error bars are overlapping here. In 1940, the first post-treatment period here, we don't see very much difference, but remember those maps were largely made, dated in like 1937, 1938, so maybe there's just not enough kind of implementation going on. And then in 1950 and 1960, we see huge jumps. So remember, 1950 and 1960 are the noisiest years because those are the 2 years from which I'm getting the smallest samples, or from the NHGIS data set. But we see a clear divergence here where graded cities got far more segregated in exactly the time period when you would expect them to. After the HOLC policy was implemented, and then as these larger federal housing policies, the FHA and the GI Bill, also started adopting these redlining policies. The results stabilized in 1970 and basically have not changed since. So the gap that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s has not closed at all along this one measure of racial segregation. There are kind of slightly different but complementary distributions when looking at dissimilarity index and information theory indices. There's kind of comparable levels of segregation before HOLC. Dissimilarity is the only place where there are statistically significant differences beforehand. But again, on both of these indices, we see huge divergence in exactly the time period when we would expect it to be. And then that gap basically stabilizes for the rest of the time period, that this gap is not kind of closed at all. Yeah. This is all people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So the next few slides, I'm going to show a series of coefficient plots with 95% confidence intervals from various specifications, and I'm focusing on the DID estimator, which is again that coefficient on the interaction between HOLC graded in the post-treatment time period. All models include division by year fixed effects and standard errors that are clustered at the place level. So starting with black isolation, we see the 4 models that I described earlier. So OLS with 1930s covariates, pre-treatment covariates, OLS with pre-treatment and time-changing covariates, fixed effects, city fixed effects with no covariates, and then city fixed effects with time-varying covariates. So we see kind of on average, black isolation was between 5 and 14 points higher in appraised cities in the decades after HOLC was implemented. White-black dissimilarity was also higher in graded cities, and the time-varying controls here had less of a kind of dampening effect on the DID estimator. So on average, cities had dissimilarity indices that were between 6 and 9 points higher. And there's a similar pattern when looking at information theory index. So across all 3 measures of segregation, we see pretty large differences between appraised and unappraised cities. And contextualizing this, the magnitude of these results for just a second, if we concentrate on the dissimilarity index and the preferred model, which is this model number 3, which has city fixed effects and no time-varying coefficients. Dissimilarity in my sample peaked in 1950 at around 65 or 0.65, and then by 2010 had come down to 0.28. So this is a 37-point change over these 60 years. And the preferred model, again, suggests that HOLC had a kind of 9-point effect on dissimilarity. So contextualizing this magnitude, the effect of HOLC is equivalent to about a quarter of this 6-decade change in dissimilarity index. So now moving on to this exploitation of imperfect implementation, starting with the kind of inside-out approach. And all these models include city fixed effects, the division by year fixed effects, but no contemporaneous covariates because they could be pathways through which HOLC affects segregation, and therefore there's an ignorability assumption concern. So here are the DID estimators for isolation for progressively large samples. So this first kind of positive but not significant sample is within cities that are within 1/10 of a standard deviation of the 40,000 cutoff. So there are only 671 city years in this sample, so not enough statistical power to see an effect here. And cities range from around 30,000 to around 50,000. But starting with 2/10 of a standard deviation away from the 40,000 and then up to a standard deviation away, the findings stabilize and are basically the same across these progressively large samples. And there are identical patterns when looking at dissimilarity and information theory indices, that there are kind of significant and stable estimates starting at this kind of 20% of a standard deviation around this 40,000 cutoff. So now going to the kind of outside-in approach here. So this starts with pulling all the cities. So this sample includes all the cities between the smallest graded city to the largest ungraded city. So LaGrange, Illinois, at around 11,000 or 10,000, to Elizabeth, New Jersey, ungraded, but 114,000. And then goes to the second smallest graded, to the second largest ungraded, third, fourth, fifth, to the sixth smallest graded and the sixth largest ungraded. And we can see that there's fairly stable results across all of these subsamples. And again, almost identical findings across all three measures. So flagging some of the important limitations that I've kind of already brought up, but just bringing them back up again, there are a number of limitations. Most importantly, the fact that HOLC was not randomly assigned. So I leveraged this imperfect implementation of the HOLC guidelines to show that the results hold among cities right around this 40,000 cutoff. So the argument that I'm making here is that all of these cities were kind of at risk of treatment of being graded. My reliance on different census data sources is also important to flag. Again, the results hold using different segregation measures before tracts existed, excluding those two noisiest years of 1950 and 1960. And kind of stepping back from the particulars here, for changing tract boundaries to threaten my findings, any kind of segregation bias in tract boundary definitions would have to be kind of correlated with HOLC appraisal net of city fixed effects and pre-treatment and contemporaneous covariates in some models. So this is certainly possible, but I think it's far more likely that a policy that was designed to segregate people actually had a segregationist effect. The specific mechanisms through which HOLC segregated individuals definitely warrant further study. Again, there's this Dan Aronson et al. Paper showing that kind of within cities, HOLC neighborhood boundaries had this effect on neighborhood level racial makeup. And I have some kind of weak evidence showing that there may have been a kind of cross-city migration effect here as well. But Again, the findings hold when I'm including time-varying racial makeup within the models. Importantly, I think that my focus on cities is a really important limitation as well. That this focus prevents me from estimating or exploring the effects of HOLC on larger geographies like metropolitan areas. For example, the phenomena of white flight and suburbanization are not all that well captured here, in part due to the fact that many suburban cities were constructed in the post-war period and therefore aren't in my sample because I don't observe them before they existed. And again, the findings are much stronger when I do add them. So it's likely, I think, that this sampling restriction biases my results kind of downwards and underestimates the effect of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So to kind of sum up and conclude, HOLC appraisals likely led to increased segregation on the place level. And this gap between appraised and unappraised cities remains remarkably stable over over half a century. There are, of course, much broader consequences if this result is right. We can think about material consequences like wealth accumulation, economic mobility, educational opportunity, as well as kind of cultural consequences. You know, Ira Katz-Nelson and David Roediger argue that the contemporary white identity was largely created through this process of suburbanization that was underwritten by these federal policies. And of course, there's contemporary political relevance as we are kind of sticking one toe in a conversation about the implications of the fact that the federal government may have been, of course was, responsible in shaping some of the racial inequality that we see today, and whether or not we should do anything directly to remedy that. Undoing a century's worth of damage will likely require as substantial an investment in housing made by these New Deal policies, but in a specifically anti-racist intent. The segregationist legacy of these New Deal housing policies serve an even larger social project by endorsing the idea that racism was a tool with which white Americans can improve their neighborhoods and build wealth for themselves. HOLC, FHA, and the GI Bill not only encouraged and institutionalized racist ideas about black people and black places, but invested heavily in them, thereby ensuring that the inherited housing inequality remains one of the most powerful structural determinants of racial stratification generations later. And I think I probably talked for a little bit too long, so thank you for your patience and welcome your questions. I don't know. Yes. Oh, yes, yes, yeah.
I have no doubt that racism existed out there and still does. But here's the question. I guess income matters in determining whether or not you can afford a mortgage and thus ownership. So I haven't heard a word about income differences between blacks and whites. And I wonder if the literature, at least on the 30s, speaks to income differences between blacks and whites and how it impacts on the mortgage market and home ownership.
Yeah. Yeah, so there has been a lot of work trying to basically explain away racial segregation by socioeconomic differences between groups. And the best research that I've seen has shown that when you start adding covariates to models of differing neighborhood attainment by race that you can get rid of the coefficients or make null the coefficients for Asian white differences and Latino white differences, but you can't get rid of the black-white difference. So there's a persistence net of income, of education, of family structure, et cetera, in black and white neighborhood attainment. Part of that story has to be about wealth, and we know that wealth inequality is perhaps one of, if not arguably, the greatest site of racial inequality in America. If you think about it from a ratio perspective, the difference between white and black median household wealth is larger than the difference in black and white incarceration. And we know that wealth is also not all that well correlated with income. And that's because it's often inherited. That white households are more capable of inheriting wealth than African Americans, and they inherit more wealth when they do inherit wealth. And that is directly linked to these federal housing policies that provided this tool for wealth accumulation, but in an explicitly segregationist manner. And that said, I mean, even trying to kind of explain away this segregation with with socioeconomic differences is problematic in the fact that it is ignoring this historical legacy of exclusion. George Lipschitz has this great argument in Possession and Investment of Whiteness, where he is pretending to be a mortgage lender, and he says, we can't give you a loan today because we so effectively discriminated against members of your race in the past that you haven't been able to accumulate enough wealth to hand down over the generations. And so even this exercise of trying to say how much of racial difference in neighborhoods is due to income inequality or wealth inequality without this historical context, again, of explicit racial exclusion is kind of theoretically and empirically incomplete.
Yeah, I raise this issue only not because it tends to deflate the importance of race, but rather to maybe redirect our attention to labor markets and the presence of race in labor markets in impacting on income differences and therefore impacting on ability to get mortgages and therefore to accumulate wealth in the form of home.
Yeah, but even when you even when you look within income quintiles, there are enormous racial differences in wealth, and the largest differences in wealth are among the wealthiest households. And other work of mine has looked at mortgage lending differences and the kind of dynamic roles of race and income in lending, and the largest gap in subprime lending at the peak of the housing boom was among the wealthiest borrowers. And that's because African Americans and Latinos making $250,000 were more likely to get subprime loans than whites making $35,000. So that says to me is that this is not a labor market story at all. This is a story. Well, I mean, $250,000 versus $35,000. I mean, the cash flow issue here can't be driving this difference. It has to be a story about inherited wealth and a story about what we now know from whistleblowers within lending institutions, that African Americans and Latinos were targeted because of this, because they had historically been excluded from prime mortgage credit that was backed by the federal government. Yeah.
Jacob, you start in 20 and 30, and I can understand why, because that goes back to the dissertation, goes back to trains and
Yeah, right.
different sides of the tracks.
Yeah.
But what
Yeah.
in industrial cities, and then there might return migration and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking, you know, what's in your sample versus what else is out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is in the contemporary answer to that paper, to that question, is in the paper, and I think that the cities represent the majority of African Americans today. But it's a good question to look at the kind of pre-treatment representation. Yeah.
Certainly in cities in the South and,
Yeah.
and so forth. And, you know, that you might have some information, you know, the blacks who moved north of Milwaukee, moved to the plants,
Yeah.
lived in these segregated places.
Yes, right.
And so forth. But I guess a little more setting like that might help set it. I don't disagree with, you know, the rest of what you've done.
Yeah.
And it's pretty convincing.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just lastly say that I think, migration is a mechanism, potentially, right? Yeah.
Actually, just related to that, just a question about the sample in terms of, because a lot of the leverage you get here is comparison of the HOLC surveyed cities and the ones that weren't. Can you tell us about, right? So you're trying to rule out some of the potential differences, right?
Yeah.
That it actually was about the survey and not, but you didn't really tell us about. What do those samples look like? So, I was looking at your map.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, that looks like most of the major metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
I was trying to, kind of.
Yeah.
So in terms of, these are some of the biggest cities in the country. This is what percent of the population.
Right.
And then you're comparing it to what kind of cities and what percent. You know what I mean? So I'm just trying to just get a sense of, well, as we compare these cities moving along, even if somebody, and again, I think most people agree in a policy explicitly designed to segregate likely achieved its end.
Yeah.
But just if you were trying to just think, okay, is there anything else that potentially could, sort
Right.
of be telling a different story?
Mm-hmm.
Part of it would have to be about who are these places, and are they have different histories, are they
Yep.
different regions? So anyway, so I just wanted to hear about sort of the difference in the sample.
Right. If you just do like a means test of all the covariates that I have, the biggest difference between appraised and unappraised cities before HOLC is population because of this cutoff rule. What I can show you here is our distributions of perhaps the things that we would think of as most important if there was a kind of confounding here, which are the distributions in 1930 on the top and then 2010 on the bottom of each of the three segregation measures. You can see that, like, at the mean, not only at the mean are these cities pre-treatment quite similar, but also the distributions of all three are almost identical before treatment, and then today quite different. We can look at differences in, maybe we should look more closely at differences in black population or foreign-born populations before treatment. But these would be the things that I would be kind of most concerned about if there was in terms of pre-treatment differences. If, again, these are just cities that were already on different trajectories in terms of the outcome. Right. Yeah.
So I was wondering, you kind of showed that we can see that this policy has affected segregation and these different ways that you're measuring it. I was wondering if you've looked at any outcomes for which segregation could maybe be the mechanism. Like, I'm primarily thinking of education outcomes, so either test score differences between black and white, or like educational attainment, those kinds of things. And it might be a data problem. I don't know if you have that, but I think.
Yeah. Well, so this is the Liz Ananot paper, which is like the best IV paper that I think I've ever read, where she uses. What's that? Yeah. So she uses like railroad maps from the late 1800s as an IV for contemporary segregation, and her outcomes are black poverty and inequality, I believe. And finds a detrimental effect there. And she has another paper using the same IV, looking at black political efficacy, and there's a negative effect there. I'm sure she has other outcomes that she's looked at as well. There's other work in progress that I'm doing, again showing that there's a connection between mortgage finance over this time. So the places that were redlined in the 1930s are still redlined on average today. I'm working with those economists at the Federal Reserve to look into neighborhood level differences in some of the like Chetty outcomes, and we're seeing pretty strong signals, pretty strong relationships between HOLC grade and contemporary measures of mobility. But yeah, I mean, I think you could use this as, this is just the middling step of a pathway to many other outcomes for sure. Yeah.
This is a much more smaller question, but I'm sort of thinking about the micro foundations here. We've talked a lot about sort of implicitly owner-occupied homes and mortgages, therefore.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm a would-be landlord
Yeah.
in a redline area,
Yeah.
what are the implications of the redlining for me? Maybe those
Right.
differ based on
Right.
whether I'm white or African-American.
So this ends up being a really fascinating and complicated question, and related to something that I mentioned earlier, which is that when I looked into these kind of different measures of appraisal heterogeneity, basically across cities, I wasn't getting the results you would expect. I thought more of this is redlined, it'd be more segregated, that kind of thing. And then just kind of don't find that. And part of that has to do with the fact that neighborhoods that were given A's and to largest extent B's, we know exactly why. They were wealthy and they were white and they were homeowners and they were not at risk of infiltration. So they were kind of geographically distant largely from immigrants, the wrong immigrants, and African Americans. There was a lot more heterogeneity in why neighborhoods got D grades. It could be because there was a single black person living on the block. It could be because 40% of the people in this neighborhood are Italian. It could be because the housing quality was not so great. It could be, as was the case in many cities, where the residential security maps were made in, or kind of advised by real estate concerns, where the grades were used as a tool for real estate speculation. So real estate investors kind of could guess that this part of the city was going to be valuable in a decade. If I can convince the HOLC appraiser to give it a D, the homeowners there won't be able to get mortgage assistance, they'll foreclose, I'll be able to buy up the land and then build an apartment building. So if you look, for example, I don't have it here, but like most of Lower Manhattan got D grades, including most of the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side, which kind of have always been largely renters. So the kind of homeowner-renter story here is really interesting and really complicated. Again, I think we know that A and B neighborhoods were probably almost all owners, but that ratio is more varied and worthy of several dissertations for looking at the C and D neighborhoods. Again, all of those appraisal data are all free and available. So there are many people need to download all the text, and because there are these rich narratives, this is well beyond what I showed you here. They're like paragraph level descriptions of every single neighborhood that these appraisers made. Yeah. Yeah.
Question. I'm curious on your explanation for the steady state since the 50s and 60s, as opposed to compounding or as opposed to regression to the mean.
Yeah, so
Because at some point, they were at least deemed illegal practices, even if they weren't taken out of practice.
Right.
And other points, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So there is a kind of path dependence answer to that story, which is like, I could just cite the John Logan 2005 piece where he's like, places have always been segregated, but there was this one point in time in history where the government made this huge investment and then just created segregation, and segregation perpetuates segregation through a million different mechanisms, which is also the Chryson and Crowder argument. There's an inheritance of wealth argument. There's where, because African Americans are not able to engage in this intergenerational process, they're increasingly perhaps restricted to the same neighborhoods over time. There's this real estate speculation process where, again, the kind of types of housing and quality of housing just gets locked in over the course of these 3 decades. That doesn't really seem to change over time. And in my my other paper looking at kind of mortgage lending inequalities, I argue that there is a kind of social stigma about these places that gets carried over time. So I have kind of other experimental work, for example, showing that, if you try to sell a used iPhone and say you're from a poor black neighborhood, you have a 18% chance, 18% lower chance of getting a response than if you were from a wealthy white neighborhood. So, the kind of social language around neighborhoods carries over time as well. And there's also like Pat Sharkey's work showing the kind of multi-generational structure of disadvantage, that the poor basically get stuck in these neighborhoods. So I think there are a lot of varied answers to these questions. But another part of it is that, we are still far more segregated than I think we are in general. Yeah.
Units question. Some of what you're describing is you're saying something about cities,
Mm-hmm.
but your units are places.
Yes.
Cities?
Yes.
So, none of these are cities. None of the estimates are city estimates. They're place.
Right.
And the places are within cities. And no, is that not right?
No, that's not right. So census places, some of them are cities. So like New York City is a census place. The census places are like independent municipalities. So there's no within city place that I'm aware of.
That was my misunderstanding.
Yes.
I think it's going to answer the second question, which is places here are IID. They do not spill over between each other in this analysis. Is that right?
So I have a slide for this. So I was expecting there to be spillover, that if if the city next door got redlined, that would affect segregation in my city. And so I tested this by looking at proximity to a redlining map as the treatment here. And there seems to be basically no proximity story here at all, which is pretty surprising. But again, kind of reinforces this idea that it is this kind of specific place level effect, and that, or that my sample is excluding places because of this pre-treatment requirement, that like what I'm missing here is the kind of white suburban division that gets developed right outside of a city in 1950, which would again be a downward bias in my results.
so again, maybe I just don't conceptualize. I'm having a hard time reconciling this slide with what you just said. Is that cities that are nearest to places, so cities that have been redlined have higher levels of segregation.
Yeah.
If you're near a city that was redlined, it doesn't appear to matter. But I mean, let's just juxtapose that with the 8 Mile analogy. I mean, that's a different municipality, right? That's Warren, that's Roseville,
Yeah.
that's Grosse Pointe,
Yeah.
right? So those municipal boundaries are hugely important in contemporary segregation. So again, maybe I'm just trying to reconcile those two. They seem contradictory, at least initially, and I'm trying to. I'm sure thought about this more than I have. So I'm curious what you're just trying to think about both those balls in the air. I'm having a hard time juggling.
Yeah. No. I think it's this question is kind of where I am with this paper because there is this interesting contradiction, and I'm tempted to jump to the Detroit is a strange place response, like, that level of segregation, that segregation existed pre-treatment, which is why there was the wall there, right? So we wouldn't see the kind of change. We wouldn't see that all white neighborhood get more all white. So there'd be just kind of flat there. My response before was you can imagine that all white neighborhood just not existing before there was this huge federal subsidy to suburbanize if you were white. And because we know that all of, I don't have this chart here, but if you look at like population growth in the United States over the past century, city population has been completely flat over the past century, and all population growth in America has been in suburbs. And a lot of that is in these kind of new places that popped up post-treatment for me. So I'm not including them in this chart because they're not in my analytical sample. But again, when I remove that sampling restriction, I don't know if it's in the appendix slides here, I get much larger kind of coefficients on the DID estimator. I suspect largely because I'm pulling in these 1970 and later cities that didn't exist before in suburbs.
Do you see a proximity effect?
I should look at that. This is only in the analytical sample, but yeah.
So I'm looking over your syllabus now for segregation and public policy.
Yeah.
I'm curious
Uh-oh.
what made you go with the more popular articles rather than like the academic articles in book?
Because it's a master's level class, and I feel bad asking master's level students to read academic articles. In fact, Liz Ananot's going to come up again because in the first lecture of that class, I have an excerpt from her methods section where she discusses what an IV is, and I read it to the class and then say, I don't expect you to have understood any of the words that I just said. So that's why it's, because it's a master's level class. Yeah.
So one of your some of your implications for this kind of data is like looking at like reparation and whatnot. Is another implication looking at like the underlying racism being from like associating like at risk and associating that with like black or something, and that happens a lot today, and that affects a lot of things like healthcare, education, and so many things. So how is that another implication, like trying to understand the kind of legally racist institution for yourself?
Yes. Absolutely, right? I mean, that's the Brian Stevenson has this great point about I think it's Brian Stevenson that the greatest crime of slavery was not the enslavement of people, but the creation of this idea of racial superiority of one people over another people. So again, I think that the kind of ingrained, by connecting proximity to African Americans as inherently risky, They kind of created this enormous financial incentive to segregate. And we've now, I mean, this is just one policy, right? We're not talking about the kind of layers of policy that were put on top of this, like highways, that again, FHA manuals encouraged city planners to use highways to segregate neighborhoods to secure higher grades for people. We're not talking about our public education system, which also creates an enormous financial incentive for wealthy people to segregate. You know, the problem here again is not that HOLC invented racism in real estate, but that it gave it institutional backing and trillions of dollars.
That one?
All right. Thank you.